Please welcome President and CEO of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, Nick Donahue.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing today? Great. So I'm up here to introduce our keynote speaker, but before I do that, can we just give a big round of applause for all the presenters and the folks who have come here and just brought themselves to this work to help us move forward. Just a powerful array of intellect and practice and commitment and heart and mind, and it's just a pleasure. So I'm going to intro our keynote speaker. Time allowed afterwards, we'll have a short Q&A between the two of us, and then we'll go on to the afternoon's activities. So Pedro Antonio Noguera is a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. A sociologist, Pedro's research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by the demographic trends in local, regional, and global context. He's a prolific author. 13 books have his name on them. He's authored over 250 research articles, book chapters, and briefs and reports. Serves on numerous boards, both nationally and of local organizations, the Economic Policy Institute, the National Equity Institute, and The Nation magazine. He appears as a regular commentator. He has access to the media centers of power in this country, and his voice is influential and present. He has a long academic history, including 7 honorary degrees, advisor to state leaders. But I think more importantly, he's the father of 5 children, so he deserves a round of applause for that, with his partner and wife. And more so, Pedro is determined and committed to fighting poverty, inequity, facing the issues of race and class that befuddle us still, and he's committed to helping others think along these lines. And when I think about Pedro, I think about a person with a big mind and a big heart. And with that, I'd ask you to welcome Pedro Noguera to the stage.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Aurora Institute. I thought I was coming to a different institute until they told me the name had changed. I want to, first of all, recognize the indigenous people of this region on whose land we are meeting. It's always important to honor the people who came before us. And I want to just say that I'm so glad to be at a conference in education where we're really trying to think outside the box. Because we've been in a box for a while, haven't we? And that box has taken us to where we are. And if you follow the news, at least the education news, and if you follow me on Twitter, I always follow the news, and I promise I don't insult people on Twitter. I try to educate, inform, and hopefully uplift. But the news this week on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, also known as the Nation's Report Card, was bleak. Because not only were we largely flat, but in several areas we went down. Went down in reading, for example, in 8th grade. And I was doing an interview on Monday with a reporter from the Seattle Times about why, and I said, well, probably because kids aren't reading enough. Wow, what a brilliant analysis, huh? But think about it for a moment. Ask yourself now, how many of your kids are reading? And what would happen if we got kids reading on their own in the summer? We've made this seem much harder than it is. And so I want to encourage you, even as you think about innovation, to not get fixated on gimmicks. There are no gimmicks out there that will suddenly make your schools better and your kids smarter, right? And I think part of the problem in education is we have focused on fads and gimmicks, and as we know, they shift every few years, a new one comes along, and we think this will solve everything, and it never does. Because it always comes down to the basic ingredients. If you don't have a coherent curriculum, and you're not clear about how to teach that curriculum to the children, chances are you're going to see kids not performing, because if you don't close the gap between the skills of the staff and the needs of the kids, nothing changes. If you're not building the professional capacity of the staff, because as we know, education is one of the few fields where we will deliberately assign the least experienced teachers to the most challenging kids. I'm so glad we don't do that to pilots, right? But we do it to teachers all the time. And then we wonder why that 22-year-old who came in so enthusiastic looks like she's 52 by the end of the year and doesn't want to be a teacher anymore, and the kids haven't learned anything. Third, you've got to engage families. You've got to engage parents. And in many schools, that's an oversight. And it's often overlooked. And the research shows parents always matter. Because when we can get reinforcement for learning at home, kids do better in school. But getting parents involved involves trust and respect across differences. And guess what? It tends to be the kids who are doing least well often have the parents who are least involved, or the parents with the most strained relationships with the schools. Fourth, you got to have a culture that affirms the importance of learning, a culture that lifts the morale of the staff, a culture that's student-centered, that fosters strong, positive relationships. Every school already has a culture. Some cultures are dysfunctional. Some cultures are adult-centered. Some cultures are characterized by what I call blame, blaming the kids. Anytime I go to a school where they're blaming the kids for low achievement, I know that's a school that will never improve. Some people get more sophisticated. They won't blame the kids. They'll blame global warming, or they'll blame junk food or too much social media. And again, when you're blaming someone else, it means you're not focused on the right work. And fifth, you've got to have leadership. And I think people get that one mixed up too, because they think, well, you just got to find that special superintendent, that special principal to lead this. And what they miss is that it's got to be shared leadership. Teachers have to be leaders. Your receptionist has to be a leader, because your receptionist is the first person to interact with the parents. And if that person does not know how to make people feel welcome, you have a problem at the front door. So I want you to think about those 5 ingredients, because the research shows if you get those 5 ingredients working, your school will improve. University of Chicago, the Consortium on School Improvement, did the research. They studied school reform. Question they asked is, many schools have been reformed, which ones got better and stayed better? And all the schools that had those 5 essential ingredients are the schools that have made progress, and those schools are out there. And here's one of the problems in education. We don't learn from those schools. In fact, in many cases, we act like they don't even exist. We don't do that in sports. If you got a good team, and I'm not a fan, but the Patriots are a good team, people will try to learn how do they cheat so well to get to the Super Bowl every year, right? But hey, they win, so we got to learn from them, right? And we do that in medicine. We say, well, they made a breakthrough with this disease over here. Let's figure out what they did so we can do it over here. We got the same problems. In education, we don't do that. In education, even sometimes in the same building, there will be a teacher who knows how to get kids engaged, who knows how to get them moving, making tangible gains, real evidence that these kids are learning, and that teacher will be surrounded by colleagues who don't know how to do it and never learn from that person. In fact, in a sick school, that person will hide because they're afraid that their colleagues will haze them or something for being too good, making them look bad. And if you're wondering, do I have a teacher like that in my school? You know what you have to do? Ask the kids. They'll tell you. They'll tell you which teachers know how to get them inspired, which teachers know how to get them engaged, which teachers actually get them to learn. But it takes courage to ask the kids, doesn't it? because the kids will tell the truth. Because they'll also tell you where they're not learning anything, where they're watching a bunch of movies or where the disorganized teacher is there and where the classroom is in chaos. They'll tell you. And now the issue is, what are you going to do about what you know? So I am interested in the work of this group, of the foundation. I do believe transformation is necessary. When I got to UCLA, we started a Center for the Transformation of Schools. Because we said this work we've been doing in reform is just not, it's tinkering with a bad model. And that's not going to get us to where we need to be. But I also know that you can't move from the schools we have to what we need to be overnight. And so we got to figure out how to operate within that green zone, how to produce some innovation within the system that provides real-life examples to people of what is possible. So let me give you an example. I was approached by a brand new principal in New York City. She'd just come out of the Leadership Academy that was set up by the General Electric. Isn't it interesting when corporations that know nothing about education decide, we will get in the business of training your principals? So she got out, freshly minted principal, and came to see me, and she said, I need help. I said, what's wrong? She said, my kids have food fights. They throw food at each other. Every day at lunch, there's a food fight. I've got a teacher stationed at every table, and they still throw the food. And I don't know what to do. I said, well, why are you coming to me? Do I look like a food fight specialist? And she says, well, I'm afraid to go to my superintendent because I'm new. And if I tell them that I have food fights, they'll say, you shouldn't be a principal. I said, that's probably true. She said, well, can you help me? I said, yeah, I can help you. I said, tell me where your school is. She told me it was in Brownsville. I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, so I knew the neighborhood. I said, I know a school in your neighborhood where they never have food fights. Let's go visit. So we go to PS 8, led by Nairi Dixon, who had just been in the Daily News for her significant turnaround of that school in a very high poverty area. That's the part of Brooklyn that still hasn't gentrified. And we went at lunch to see how the kids eat lunch. And she was shocked because they don't eat lunch the way they do at most schools. Isn't it interesting that at most schools, kids eat lunch like they do in prison? Right? You go get that food you don't really like very much, and then you look for a place to sit, and then you leave a big mess for the custodians to clean up. At this school, kids eat family style. One kid gets the salad, another kid gets the entree. They sit at the table together, they pass it around, staff eat with them. It's a very pleasant experience. They clean up after themselves. The principal was shocked because that school was in the same neighborhood as hers. I said, what do you think is the difference between your school and this school? She said, well, these kids really know how to do lunch. I said, no, there's more to it than that. I said, there's a culture in this school that lets the kids know throwing food is not even part of the scenario here, that we treat each other with respect because they're treated with respect. And it sounds obvious, but when you see it, you know it's possible. And that, to me, is so important because I meet too many educators who don't know it's possible, who actually think the problem is the kids. And over again, I'd have to remind people, the problem is not the kids. The problem is the way we treat the kids. It's our failure to create the conditions that allow kids to learn and be successful. And so for the last several years, I've been focused on equity. And I want to say that No Child Behind was an equity-based policy. For the first time in this country's history, we had a policy that said there's got to be evidence that all kids, regardless of their backgrounds, are learning. That was important because until that time, we had lots of kids not learning and no one cared. So even though I'm a critic of No Child Behind, I have to acknowledge it took us a step forward. But then it got fixated on the wrong thing, on the standardized test. And we know that it's not just that test that matters. You got to focus on learning all the time, not just on testing time. And we also have to realize, guess what? The kids who are going to do least well are the kids who have the least. The kids who come to us hungry, the kids who don't have stable homes, the kids in foster care. What is the achievement gap all about? It is about inequality. It's an educational manifestation of inequality. That's what we've got to tackle, is inequality. You look at those NAEP scores, what do you see? You see kids in affluent communities are doing fine. The problem lies in the high poverty areas. And it's not to say we shouldn't do some innovation in affluent communities too. Just looking at an article about the PISA results. You know, PISA, the international assessment on compares countries, and psychologists wrote an article, and what the article focused on is that there's no correlation between how well a child does on the test and how much they like school. Lots of kids do well, don't like school at all. Because the model we've created actually, in too many cases, makes kids hate learning. So we've done something really wrong here. And part of what we've done wrong is we focus narrowly on academic performance and ignore the other needs of kids. The social, the emotional, the physical needs. And what that means is that too often the kids with the greatest needs are going to be the kids not only who do least well, but the kids who are most likely to be punished. Think about your school and ask yourself, who do you suspend? Who are the kids in the office to get disciplined? It's almost always the most disadvantaged students. And it's almost always because they have unmet needs. We focus on the behavior, not the need. And you know what happens if you don't address the need? The behavior doesn't go away. It gets worse. And so when we focus on equity, we start to see the whole person. Nick told you I have 5 kids. I said, that's why I'm an equity expert. Anybody with more than one child is practicing equity at home, because you already realize they're not the same. And when we see our children as individuals, not through a stereotype, not through a test score, but as a person, we start to realize, oh, we have to focus on all the needs. And as we do, we have to also focus on the outcomes. Now, I want to say that outcomes matter. The test scores can't be ignored. The grades can't be ignored. Graduation rates can't be ignored. But we have to also be clear about how we get better outcomes. If you wanted to lose weight, I don't think you would spend your time getting a really fancy scale and weighing yourself as often as you could, which is pretty much the approach we've taken to raising achievement. We focus on testing. Right? What we completely ignored is the need to focus on teaching and learning. How do we get kids engaged? That work, the work that this foundation is about, I would say is what we should have been doing all along, but we have too often ignored. So most of you by now have seen this diagram. How many of you have not seen this diagram? And I think it makes the case pretty clearly. If you don't focus on equity, you're going to invariably leave some people out. What we don't see is this. Some people start out way ahead than others because their families have more money, more resources, more education. The strongest predictor for how our kids will do in school is family income. When you combine family income with parent education, particularly the education of the mother, because the mother's usually the first teacher, you can predict with great consistency how well kids will do. That's what we have to disrupt, that consistency, that predictability. And you can only disrupt it if you eliminate the barriers to learning. That's what equity is about, eliminating the barriers to learning. So what are the barriers? Well, in a lot of places, it's the backgrounds of our kids that's driving outcomes. You can almost look at the classroom and tell, is this an AP or a gifted class or a remedial or special ed class? How many say that looks like my school? Here's what we know. There's talent in all kinds of communities. All kinds of communities. There's talent in the trailer parks, talent in the housing projects. If a child is lucky enough to have athletic talent, chances are we might find them. We can find football players anywhere. Belle Glade, a little poor, dirt-poor town in Florida outside of West Palm Beach, has produced more professional football players than any town in America for the last 20 years. It's dirt poor. Why? Because we love football. People say it's also because the grass is so high, kids have to run fast. I say if we actually cared about kids, we could produce engineers and doctors and lawyers and scientists and writers out of Belle Glade too. It's a question of our priorities and our focus. We have not guaranteed every child an opportunity to learn. We've been focused on the wrong things. So let's be clear, equity can't be about lowering the standards and making excuses. We can't allow it to become nothing more than a clever slogan. No Child Left Behind was a clever slogan. But when Marian Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, Leave No Child Behind, it didn't mean test the kids as often as possible. She did mean address nutrition and health and housing, because we're a rich country and every child has basic needs. It can't be an issue that we only think is relevant to schools serving poor kids or kids of color. I work with an affluent district right now in Silicon Valley. They have huge equity issues, even though the average GPA for their seniors at one high school was 4.3. And they're going to some of the top colleges in the country because their parents, they're the children of engineers, and they still have equity issues. You know what they are? Depression, anxiety, suicide, sleep deprivation, bullying. But because they get good grades and good scores, people don't look at those issues, even though the kids are literally dying in front of them. When we see the whole child, we recognize that the social and the emotional needs are connected to the performance. And so when we're doing equity work, we have to focus at the classroom level on making sure that all kids have access to what many of us now call deeper learning. And so that it doesn't just become yet another clever phrase. Deeper learning is just about using your higher order thinking skills. And anybody who's been around kids knows all kids can engage in that higher order thinking. What's the most common question you've ever heard from a 3-year-old? Why? They want to know. Why? Why do I have to take a bath? And they're serious. They want to hear about sanitation. And what will happen if I don't take a bath? And why do I have to eat vegetables? What will happen to my body? And why is the sky blue? They are curious, and that's why often we need help when they ask questions like this, don't we? Because sometimes the questions are too hard for us to answer on our own. You know what we know now? When you feed and nurture a child's curiosity, they can become independently motivated learners. That's what we know. We've known that for a long time. It's the reason why the most popular subject amongst children up until middle school, when we screw it up, is science. Because science is where kids get to answer and learn about their bodies, learn about the world, discover new things. All our kids could be scientists of some kind. Maybe they don't go off and work at a lab somewhere, but they are curious, and if we tap into that curiosity, give the kids the chance to do independent research so they can think deeply about something, we will see a change in the way they think, in the change in their habits about learning. What's the evidence that we're doing it right? The kids will want more. They will want to learn more. I have seen this over and over again, and that's why I know it's possible. Work with a school in Los Angeles, not far from where the fires are occurring right now. 100% low income, 100% Latino, half the kids English learners, 4th highest graduation rate in Los Angeles. It's in a neighborhood surrounded by gangs. Hasn't had a fight in 7 years. It's safe, not because of their security, but because the staff has strong relationships, which they forge with the kids starting 3 days before school starts. They do community building to get to know the kids. I said, how do you get the kids to come 3 days early? He said, we just tell them they have to, and they show up. It's the only school in Los Angeles where the students evaluate their teachers. I said, how do you get the union to agree with that? They said, well, the union doesn't even know, but our local does, and they support it. I asked the teachers, what's it like to work here? They said, it's great because we plan together, we work together. Teachers don't work in isolation because they understand the biggest obstacle to improving teaching is the isolation of our teachers. That's why they have very little turnover. I said, what's the hardest thing about working here? They said, oh, the feedback from the kids, because they don't hold back. And one teacher said she had a girl who told her she was disorganized. She was so upset they didn't talk for 2 years. She said, but the other day the girl said I was getting better, and now we're in speaking terms. I thought when I visited, they're only showing me the good things. There must be something I'm missing. So I asked to speak to some students, and they brought in about 20 kids to the library. And I asked them what it's like to work here. They said, well, this is like a family. We all support each other. I said, well, how often are you inspired by what you learn in school? Several kids shot up their hands and said, every day we're inspired. I said, I don't believe you. I go to too many schools. I said, what did you learn yesterday? I said, yesterday we learned about the forced sterilization of women that was occurring in this country in the 1930s. We learned about it first in science as part of our eugenics lesson. Then we learned more about it in history. I was so upset I went home, talked about my parents. We went on the internet to find out why it happened, where it happened, who was behind it. And what happens when kids get a good education? They want more education. That's what happens. That's how we know we're doing it right. And if that can happen in Pacoima, it can happen anywhere in America. Because all kids need to have that chance to use those higher order thinking skills. We have been fixated on preparing kids for jobs and for college. And let me say, as a parent, those are important things. I want all my kids to have jobs. I certainly don't want them living with me for the rest of their lives. But what happens when you work with kids who already know they're not going to college? Or who are pretty sure they're going to end up in dead-end jobs because that's where their parents are? How do you inspire them? How do you convince them that they should still learn? We can't rely on the promise of something better. We have to show them that they can use education to solve real problems in their lives, to help their families and their communities. We've been using fear as a motivator for kids. What we should be using is hope. Hope that they could use education to take on the big problems this world is facing that this generation is passing on to them. Our kids will have to be problem solvers to fix global warming. They'll have to be problem solvers and real creative to figure out how to address inequality. The knowledge we have right now is not good enough. We need to make sure that these kids come prepared and are able to do the things that we know is possible because it's happened before. But for that to happen, we're going to have to teach differently. Our classrooms are going to have to be different. We're going to have to stop expecting kids to learn the way we teach and start teaching them the way they actually learn. Now, as a college professor, I know that sounds hypocritical because colleges usually offer the very worst form of education, don't we? We teach through lecture. You know why? Because it's easy. In fact, all the colleges I've taught at before, and I've taught some good ones, Berkeley, Harvard, NYU, UCLA, I've never been expected to go through any training to become a professor. Not once. I got no help on how to write a syllabus. I got no help on figuring out how to assess my students. They assume you have a PhD, you can do that. And all of us, how many of you have had a professor that clearly didn't know how to teach? When we are teaching well, we are focused on getting kids engaged. And when we get kids engaged and develop their curiosity, learning becomes fun. And I know that might sound trivial, but it's magical actually when it happens. I was at an elementary school in Baltimore. Very, very poor community in a very, very poor neighborhood with lots of violence, lots of social problems. Visiting a first grade classroom. And the teacher brings in a hermit crab. And she's got everybody's attention because the kids are curious. She said, what are your questions? They say, well, we want to know where the eyes are. How can you tell if it's a boy or a girl? What does it eat? How did it get that house? Lots of questions. And after taking on their questions, she said, I want you to draw a picture of that crab, write a story about the crab. They were learning about science, learning about their environment, learning of developing their language skills, and for an hour and a half, totally engaged, no disruptions. And I asked the teacher, why are you bringing in the crab? She said, because it's like magic, isn't it? I said, I see. This is an innovation. Bringing crabs to school. Woo. I don't know if that's on the agenda, but I'd say put it there, put it there. I was at another school in Syracuse, New York, a totally dysfunctional school. Principal's embarrassed as he walks through the halls with me because the kids are just not even paying attention to her. And I look out the window and I see a creek running alongside the campus. And I asked the principal, I said, what do you do with that creek? She said, what do we do? She said, we're going to build a fence around it. I said, why? She said, because it's a liability issue. I said, why don't you incorporate that into your lessons around the environment? She said, really? I said, yeah, really. She said, I'd never thought of that. I saw that happen in the Bronx. Coldest day of the year, -10 outside. Kids bundling up to go take samples from the Bronx River in their chemistry class. I said, why are you going out there? He said, oh, we have to collect samples because we're monitoring what plant life and animal life is in the river, what pollutants are in the river. We're trying to figure out where the pollutants are coming from. They told me there were beavers now found in the Bronx River. Beavers. 2 gay beavers living together in the Bronx River. They were very excited about it. I said, this is amazing. And I asked the teacher, why are you studying the Bronx River? She said, because I want the kids to see themselves as scientists and to understand that they can use this knowledge to solve real problems in the world. You don't need a lot of technology, and I'm not against technology, but you don't need technology to do this work. You do need some imagination. You do need to make sure that you are not allowing our kids to get disengaged early. How many of you have a subject that you're no good at and haven't been good at it for a long time? Anybody have a subject like that? Okay. Throughout America, we have a big fear of math in a lot of our schools. All across, and it shows in the performance of our kids. And often that starts very early. I was one of those kids. I was fine in math until I got to algebra. When they introduces the X and the Y's, oh my God, that's not math anymore. But in 8th grade, I had Miss Harris. Miss Harris told us on the first day, she said, you kids are lucky because I'm the best teacher in the school. And that meant she knew how to teach all kinds of kids. You ever meet people who say they're really good teachers, but they're only good with kids who don't need help? She knew how to work with kids who needed help. In fact, she said, who struggles in math? And I reluctantly raised my hand. She said, you kids sit up front because I need to make sure that you're with me. And I want you to raise questions. Let me know if I do something you don't understand. Because she understood if you didn't know the material in September, you certainly wouldn't understand it come June. And Miss Harris wore a lot of perfume. So if you weren't paying attention, you know what happened? You smelled just like Miss Harris after a while. So you better be on it. She understood that if we allow our kids to become disengaged early, what happens? After a while, they don't like school. Before you know it, they're out of school, and they become structurally disenfranchised. Our prisons are full of structurally disenfranchised people. Who do we incarcerate? Most often, those we fail to educate. That can be prevented too. And we have a chance if we know how to do what they're doing at Hollenbeck Middle School in East LA. Here's a 90-minute math class for 8th graders. And the kids are up out of their seat, and there's noise in the room. Good, healthy, productive noise, because that's how kids learn. They learn by talking. They learn by engaging, which means in this math class, they're not just learning math. They're learning how to work together. They're learning how to deal with conflict, how to work with people they don't like. How many of you know adults that haven't learned to work with people they don't like? And this teacher's so good, she can talk to me. If she wanted to, she could do yoga because she doesn't have to be in control. The kids are in control, which means she can be the facilitator of learning. She can see who's learning. She can get kids to learn from each other. She can differentiate support. This is the highest form of classroom management because the kids are engaged. How do we do more of that? If you can do that in East LA with all of these English learners, you could do that in any school if the teacher knows the kids and has the skills to meet the needs. So we need to make sure that access to challenging work to the high standards is not an equity issue in your schools. Because too often we go to schools and we say, oh, those kids can't do that. That's for the gifted kids. That's for the honors kids. Not for the kids who are struggling in English, not for the kids who haven't mastered basic skills. No, that's not true. If the teacher has the support and guidance on how to do it. So we've got to make sure that that support is there. We've got to make sure that the teacher knows how to get the kids to address their social and emotional needs, because you can't separate them from the academic needs. Because when kids learn how to work together, have some impulse control, when they learn how to defer gratification, what happens is kids not only become better academically, they become better as adults in navigating the world and better citizens and better people. If we don't ensure that our kids have a strong ethical foundation in their education, then we end up with Eichmanns, right? I was reading I'll paraphrase, a poem by a Holocaust survivor written as a letter to her teacher. She says, "Dear teacher, I'm suspicious of education. I'm suspicious of education because the people who designed the gas chambers were well-educated engineers. And the people who administered torture were well-educated doctors. And an education that's not grounded in human values will produce more Eichmanns." We should all be concerned about that. What are our kids learning? And how do we ensure that the learning enables them to participate in our democracy? Because our democracy is at risk, isn't it? We have a whole generation of people, including lots and lots of adults, who can't distinguish fake news from real news, who don't know how to engage in civil debate, who don't know how to listen to the other side and reason with each other. But I'm seeing kids learn to do debate right now in all kinds of subjects in all kinds of schools. And who understand that to do debate, you actually have to know what you're talking about. You have to marshal the evidence. You have to do research. You have to be persuasive. All this allows kids to develop advanced literacy in ways that allow them and prepare them for life beyond school. So for this to happen, we've got to make sure that our teachers know how to build strong relationships with kids, that they have strong content knowledge, which sounds obvious, but too often that's not the case, which know how to teach kids the way they learn and teach in a variety of ways, because not all kids learn in the same ways. Because when that happens, the power of learning becomes real. And over again, when I see this occurring in schools, I'm struck by the fact that the problems we've created in education are solvable if we focus on the right things. We've been focused on the wrong thing. We've been telling schools, raise achievement, and if you don't do it, we'll fire the superintendent, we'll fire the principal, we'll fire half the teachers, as if firing people was going to get our schools better. Like you could pressure people, the beatings will stop when you lift your morale, right? I've never seen it work. Suppose we told our teachers our job is to get our kids excited about learning. That's our job. Our job is to get our kids to see the power of knowledge. That's our job. So they want to learn more. When we shift the focus of the questions we ask, we start to realize that the path to higher achievement is through engagement. And engagement itself is complex. It's multidimensional. It's behavioral. That's the part we can see. Are they on task? But it's also cognitive. Do they understand what they're doing? Are they making connections? Can they apply what they've learned? And it is fundamentally emotional. Do they really care about what they're doing? Are they trying their hardest? Or are they just putting in, just a compliant behavior? When we focus on engagement, and if you look at the classrooms where kids are actually engaged, you often see better performance. How do we make sure the teachers know how to do that work are available to others that don't? Because not everybody does. And too often, as I said earlier, our strongest teachers are isolated from their colleagues. And so I want to encourage you to get focused on the evidence. It sounds obvious that we should be focused on evidence of learning, but I would say right now in many schools I visit, there's faith-based education going on. We just hope they learned it. We hope. Let's hope the scores went up this year. When you teach with a focus on evidence, you start to realize, we got to make sure that we are diagnosing learning needs. We've got to model for kids. We've got to give kids lots of chance to ask questions. We've got to give kids many opportunities to revise and resubmit the work because you don't do your best work on the first draft. The real learning is in the revisions. Sometimes you have to revise multiple times, and the real teaching is not in the grading, but the feedback. Helping the student to understand what they need to do differently to improve. And when these things come together, and when teachers come together to analyze student work together, things start to change. Because teachers start to see that what I do is reflected in what the kids can do. And if teachers do this on a regular basis, and if this kind of work happens without blame and incrimination, teachers can learn from each other. And we can start to ask, how come the kids are working for you, but they're not working for you? How come they read the book in your class, but in this class they refused? If we can have that conversation with shared vulnerability, we can create schools where we improve together. And so I want to encourage you to stay focused on what's happening in the classroom, on using the strategies that we know, research shows, will result in real concrete evidence that kids have learned. And again, I know this is hard. Doing a Socratic seminar, I was watching a Socratic seminar the other day, master teacher at work. Socratic seminar about Hamlet, with inner city kids, middle school kids, who did not think it was not culturally relevant to study Hamlet. Because Hamlet is what? Hamlet is about treachery. Hamlet is about betrayal. Hamlet is about a young man who thinks his mom had an affair with his uncle and tried to kill his father. Wow, can the kids relate to that treachery? Sure they can. Sure they can, and they were totally engaged. And so we have to figure out, how do we get our kids more engaged? How do we make sure that if we bring technology in, we use it in ways that facilitate that deep engagement, that allow us to personalize the learning? Because we have the tools now to do this work. The question is, are we focused on the right things? So one of the most basic questions that you've got to be able to answer to do this work is, what do you know about those students? What do you know about the kids you teach? What do you know about the challenges they face? What do you know about how they learn and about what interests them? And what do you know about their strengths and their motivation? Because if you focus on their deficits and their problems, you won't see the strengths. And so I would say that a lot of this work has to start right there. What do you know about the kids? That's something that Jaime Escalante knew. Jaime Escalante, for those of you who don't know, was a Bolivian engineer, stopped engineering, went to Garfield High School to teach calculus. Well, he actually went to teach math. They put him in a remedial math course. He said, this is a waste of time. These kids should learn calculus. His colleagues said, no, these kids can't do calculus. These kids are the children of gangbangers. These are low-wage workers. They can't do that. He said, oh, yeah, watch me. And he proceeded not only to teach calculus, but have them take the AP calculus exam. And they passed. So they assumed he had to have cheated. So they required the kids to be retested. And they passed again, and again, and again for 19 years in a row. So after a while, they sent in researchers to study his methods. They said, what's Escalante doing? And the researchers came back, and they all said the same thing. They said, it's nothing but math. Because they didn't understand what he called ganas, cultivating ganas in children, the desire to learn, challenging their beliefs about themselves. He said, you're the descendants of people who built pyramids. Math's part of your heritage. And then took them to laboratory. He said, this is why you need calculus so you can get jobs like these. I met one of his former students. She is the only Latina engineer at Boeing. And as we know, Boeing's in trouble, so she might be in trouble too now. In Southern California, and on her free time, she does robotics training in the schools. She said, I do this work because of what Escalante did for me. She said, he was there for us. He pushed us. He built strong relationships. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your games? He said, yeah, but not to cheer me on. He came to the games to tell me I stink at soccer, go back to math. Obviously, Roland Fryer, the guy to the right, an economist at Harvard, had never heard of Escalante because he came up with the novel idea that the way to produce innovation, the way to boost achievement is to pay kids. Pay them for higher scores, pay them to read, pay them to go to school. And he got a bunch of money to pay kids. And after 2 years of paying kids, they said, oh, it's not working. And they made a big announcement in the papers, paying kids doesn't work. That was the same day Jaime Escalante died, and they had the two articles juxtaposed against each other. Two different strategies for how to motivate kids. And so few people made the connection. Escalante already knew. He already knew. He already knew the power of relationships. So I want you to watch this film about the power of relationships. I think it very aptly describes what happens. Watch this teacher who's taken the shotgun away from the student, gives it to another staff member, and watch what he does next. He holds him. And I realize it's not always this simple. We live at a time of mass shootings, and we are rightfully concerned about the threat of guns in our communities and in this country. But we must know this. Ultimately, our schools are safe not because of security, but because of relationships. And it's those same relationships that ultimately will drive outcomes for kids. So if that's not part of your innovation plan, then you're focused on the wrong things. Our kids will rise to the level of our expectations. The challenge is to get the adults to believe our kids are capable of so much more. Thank you.
This is great. So I'm going to ask you about instruction from people here about how to make that happen, okay? And a connection to community. Well, that was just fantastic. Thank you so much. A big round of applause for Pedro and his words of wisdom. So we're going to spend a few minutes, just a short back and forth here. So Pedro, thank you. You know, you gave a message about, well, first let me start by saying that I work and live in New England, okay? And in New England, I'm a big Patriots fan, by the way.
Surprise, surprise.
And I just would invite you to come to that region, which we now call New Ringland. Okay. Thank you. So you gave, but that's a story about culture also, right? So you gave a heartfelt guidance to us about care about capacity, care about the parents. It's about leadership. You can't tinker. How do we get innovation within? You rightly landed on culture. You talked about not having students fit the teaching, but think about teaching on what we know about learning. And it was a message of hope because you encouraged the teachers in this room to focus on evidence, to think about assets, to know the kids. But you started your talk by talking about the conditions for success for the kids. And I'd ask you the same thing about the conditions of success for the teachers, because those are good hopes and they're good encouragements. You were very concrete about go see other places that work. But many of the people in this room work in communities where there is no time for that. There's no incentive. There's no encouragement for that. So they can certainly do it on their own. And they do. The people here are with teams of people, with principals and superintendents who have made a decision around culture. But what instruction would you give folks here who maybe aren't in those settings, where the conditions aren't right? Both for their individual work as people, as part of our system, but also collectively, you know, a place where there's not so much energy, because it sounds like a great mission, but for many people here, it's like, how do I help make that happen? I'm not the superintendent, I'm not the school board, you know, I'm a staff person here. Sure. So what guidance would you give? What have you seen that works for people to move in this direction?
So seeing really is believing, although even when you see it, like that principal he took to that school where the kids eat family style, didn't mean she could go back and do it right away. But now she knew it's possible. So that was important. And I would say over and over again, what I've seen is when you give educators a chance to observe others who are doing it differently and getting better results, that can be very powerful for them. But you can also read about it. Karen Chenoweth's written a number of books, It's Being Done, How It's Being Done, which profiles schools across the country that are getting great results, and particularly in advancing equity. And I would say that the real power comes from the collaboration amongst teachers. Giving teachers a chance to share ideas, to work together, to learn from each other. And over again, you know, most schools by now have professional learning communities. All I have to do is go into the meeting, and half the time I see teachers are actually not collaborating. They're meeting together, each one doing their own lesson plan, but there's no real collaboration. So we need to make sure that when we use time that way, that the time is actually focused on how to tackle the common set of problems that our schools and our teachers are facing. So there are strategies we can use, I think, to facilitate this.
Right. And you started by talking, one of the things you said earlier was that parents matter. And there are many people in this country who are really trying to rebalance the conversation in communities about who gets to direct changes, who gets a say in what's happening. And so what kind of connection to the community do you think is necessary here? Because it's been a long time that teachers and school professionals have been thinking about changes and improvements in the name of people who need them, so often without engaging the people who need them or their parents or guardians. Right. Can you say a little bit about what you think about that relationship building between professional educators and community members, maybe community activists and advocates?
Yeah. So think about this. Whenever you go into an affluent community or visit an affluent school and you ask the educators, who are you accountable to? They will tell you right away, to the parents we serve. Because the parents they serve let them know, you work for us, and if we're not happy, we're going to do something about it. When you go into low-income communities, or even if you go into a middle-class community, but there are poor kids, and you ask the educators who are serving those kids, who are you accountable to, they never say the parents. They're much more likely to say to the district, to the superintendent. That's the problem. When we realize that parents matter, we treat them with respect, we build a relationship, and we build a partnership that's based on the clear sense that both the parent and the teacher want the same thing for the child. We both want to see that child do well. We both have a part to play. But that takes work to get that partnership. We have, James Coleman, sociologist at Harvard, several years ago, compared parochial schools to public schools and found that when you control for income and for race, parochial schools were outperforming. And he said, well, what is there about these parochial schools? It was not about innovation. It was all about trust with families. Trust makes a huge difference.
Great. So just looking ahead, you've wrestled with these issues for a long time. You have some conclusions and some guidance. What's something that's on your mind that you're wrestling with now that's not clear to you? What do you think what's the next piece of the puzzle that you're looking at and trying to unpack?
So the big question I'm focused on is, we've known for a while that money is important, right? That we have starved and in some cases disinvested in our schools. I always say the only people who don't think money matters are people with lots of money, right? However, I see schools that get money and don't know what to do with it. I'm working now with a couple states where there's now more money available for education, and the question I'm wondering is, do we know how to use that money in ways to leverage change? And I'm concerned that if we don't invest wisely, then the critics, the skeptics will say, well, see, we're throwing money at a problem, and it's useless. And so we need to make sure that if we get those additional resources, we know how to use them to have the biggest impact on children and on learning. And that's something that concerns me, because I think in a lot of places, the clarity about how to do that is not there.
Great. We look forward to hearing more about that. Do you have we're coming to our conclusion. Do you have a last set of words you want to leave people with? What would you say to them?
The main thing I'm often asked by people, are you hopeful about what's possible? And I would be naive if I just said, yeah, oh yeah, it's wonderful times to be alive. These are scary times. If you're paying attention and reading the papers and following the news, these are very troubling times, which is all the more reason why we got to focus on education. It's our only hope for a better future, is to prepare these young people. But I alluded to this earlier in my remarks. We have to think about what kind of education our kids will need. It's not good enough to prepare them for the world as it is. We have to prepare them for the world that they need to create. And that requires our kids see themselves as creative people who can, in fact, tackle the problems we face without fear. So I am pragmatically optimistic that we can do that, because I go to enough places where I see it happening and come away feeling inspired.
Great. Well, thank you. So I have a few more words for the audience, but could you please join me in thanking Pedro for his time and his attention here today. Great. Really, really glad to hear you speak this way. I'm glad you're here at this Aurora Institute event. This is the place where we're trying to think about where the future is and what the future demands. For folks who are interested, Pedro is available from 2:15 to 3:15 in Mesquite G&H for a smaller conversation with people who choose to tap him and ask him more and better questions. And I am here, again, as a board member for the Aurora Institute to say to the audience here, while there's a full program today and there's a robust program tomorrow, this is the last time we join together in this large convocation here. I just want to appreciate a couple things. One, I encourage people as you're moving about the hotel, please thank the staff and the workers here who have served us throughout the week and will continue to serve us. If you see an Aurora Institute staff person, please thank them and engage with them. They've really put themselves out to provide this kind of setting for you. And I will just close by saying that, it is possible. I am not naively optimistic either. This is hard work, but it's possible and it's necessary. It's possible for a practical reason, which is addressing the issues you raised are the solution for our country's prosperous and just future. It's a moral imperative because we claim to have values around opportunity and success and without regard to background or zip code, and we're not there yet. And as I've said before, it's a patriotic opportunity because we get a chance to show the country and the rest of the world what a great democracy does. It nurture itself and move itself forward. So it's hard work. We've been working at it for a while. I'm just glad that folks here have a home for this work. And I'll leave you with somebody smarter than both of us once said, children are the message we send to the future, and the only question is what message are we going to send? And I'm just proud and pleased to be looking at hundreds and thousands of people who are thinking about a message of preparedness, justice, community, and leadership. So thanks for your effort, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Aurora Institute Symposium. And enjoy the rest of the program, and thank you, Pedro.
Thanks, Nick.
Great. Super. Goodbye.